We have already designed the login page for our application. It's time for us to add some functionality to the login page so we can know if the user is supposed to log in into the main section of the application. I mentioned in the previous lecture that we are not yet going to evaluate against the database, but we do want to evaluate if at least the user has written something inside of both entries. To be able to do that, we're going to start working a little bit with C#. And of course, we're going to start working inside of the code that is going to execute every time the login button is clicked. To be able to evaluate if certain string is null or if it's empty, we have a very handy method at our disposal through the string type. The string type is precisely the type of the text that is inside of the entries. And the string contains an evaluation that will return true if the string that we're evaluating is null or if it's empty. To access this evaluation, we can write down the string, which is the type, dot, and start writing is null or empty. Is null or empty again is going to return true when the string that we evaluate either is null, meaning that it doesn't really exist, or if it exists, but the value is empty. For example, when the user hasn't written anything inside of the entries. So let's type enter or tab on our keyboards to be able to access the full evaluation, and then in parentheses is where we want to pass the value that is going to be evaluated. Notice that Visual Studio allows you to know what value this evaluation is expecting, in this case a string. And we want to access the string from one of the entries. But remember that to be able to access the values from the properties of the entries, or any of their element for that matter, we need to name those elements. So let's navigate back to the main page.saml file and set some names to both entries. The first entry, for example, is going to be called email entry, and the second entry is going to be called password entry. So now that both entries have names, we can access them from C#. So we can start typing in here email entry and then access the text property. We can do that through .text, and then we have to add a semicolon at the end. So this is going to evaluate if the text inside of the email entry is null or empty, and return true if it is or false if it isn't. But we need to assign that true or false to something so we can later evaluate it. I am going to create a Boolean variable in here, and this is how you create variables. You define the type of the variable and then you define a name. In this case, is email empty. And I'm going to assign it to whatever this evaluation returns. So with this new variable that is going to be Boolean and that is going to be called is email empty, we're going to have true if the text inside of the email entry is empty or null, and false if it isn't. And then of course we're going to need to do the exact same thing for the password entry. So what I can do is create another Boolean variable that is going to be is password empty, and I want to assign it to, again, string.is null or empty, but in this case what I want to evaluate is the text inside of the password entry. Something like this. And so I now have in these two variables whether or not the text inside of the entries is null or empty. The next thing that I have to do is know if any of this is empty, because if at least one of these strings are empty, then the user can't log in. But if both of these at least have something on them, then the user can log in. To make this evaluation, I will need an if statement. This if statement is going to exactly evaluate one value against another and execute when the evaluation is true. For example, and I could evaluate if is email empty is equal to true. This would mean that the text inside of the email entry is either null or is empty, so the user didn't write anything inside of it, and so the user shouldn't be able to log in. And if this is true, then the block of code that I defined inside of this brackets is going to execute. If it isn't true, then I do need an else statement. And I also need some brackets inside of here. This is the entire if-else statement. If the evaluation between the parentheses is true, then the block of code for the if statement is going to execute. If it is false, then the block of code for the else statement is going to execute. The else statement is optional, meaning that the if can exist by itself, but the else statement cannot exist without the if. So in here, I'm only evaluating if the email is empty. But what happens if the password is empty? I need to know if it is empty as well. What I can do is add an OR evaluation in here. And I can do that with these double vertical lines. And evaluate after the vertical lines if is password empty equal to true. The OR evaluation in here will return true if at least one of these evaluations is true. So if the first evaluation is true and the second is false, the OR will still return true, meaning that the if block of code is going to execute. If this evaluation is false and the second one is true, again, the OR will return true, so this block of code will execute. And if the first is true and the second is true, the OR will still return true, meaning that this block of code will execute. The only time the OR evaluation inside of this if statement will return false is when both of the evaluations are false, in which case the block of code inside of the else statement will execute. Now, there is a way in which we can minimize the code that we are writing in here, and that is to remove this evaluation to compare a Boolean property to another Boolean. Because this evaluation is already a Boolean, this value is already a Boolean. So there's no need to evaluate it against another Boolean to return a Boolean, because it already is a Boolean. So I can remove this. If this was already true, evaluating it against true will return true. And if it is false, evaluating it against true will return false. So there's no need for that evaluation because this already has the value that we need. To be able to test this out, I am going to add a couple of breakpoints in here, which will allow me to know which block of code is going to execute in certain scenarios. What I'm going to do is going to run my application on an Android simulator and click the button on different scenarios to evaluate what block of code is going to execute. So I am here on the Android emulator ready to test what block of code is going to execute when certain values are written inside of the entries or if there is no value at all. For example, let's check what happens when I click login without writing anything inside of the entries. Notice that the first breakpoint was hit. So let's get back to Visual Studio and evaluate what has happened. The first thing that we can establish is that this is email empty is going to be true because we didn't write anything inside of the email entry. And the same is going to happen for the password because we didn't write anything there either. So this is going to be true and this is going to be true, meaning that true or true is going to be true and the if statement is going to execute. We can click on continue to make another evaluation. Back in the Android emulator again, let's write something down inside of the email address and click on the login button again. In this case, the email is not empty, but the password is, meaning that false or true still returns true, which makes this if block of code to be executed. Now let's click on continue and evaluate another thing. What happens if we do not have anything inside of the email, but we do have something inside of the password and click the login button? Still, the if statement is going to execute because true or false is still going to return true. And finally, let's click continue to evaluate what happens when we have something written down on both entries. Let's click on login and notice that now it is the else clause, the one that is going to be executed, because both the isEmailEmpty and the isPasswordEmpty values are false, meaning that false or false is false, and so finally the else statement or the else block of code is executed. Now that we have performed this evaluation and that we know that if the else block of code is executed, it means that the user did write both the email and the password, in the next lecture we're going to add a functionality for us to be able to navigate to another page right from this block of code.